When I graduated, I didn't realize how little I knew about how this actually worked. And so in today's social work survival guide, we're gonna have just a little heart-to-heart, social worker to social worker, about boundaries and what they actually are in practice and why we have them and why they make your life better as a social worker and help you prevent burnout. If you didn't watch the first video that I did in our social work survival guide about burnout, these are not the well thought out, well educated, well researched, well put together, scripted videos that I have done in the past. These are just talking as if you're talking to a social work friend about things that I think we need to talk about. So with that, of course, comes a disclaimer that this is just a chat. I hope I represent my opinions well, but this isn't one that your professor will likely be like assigning you to for you to learn so much unless they're really cool. Also, pardon me looking a mess. I literally got home from work and sitting cross-legged on my bedroom floor and talking to you now, so I hope you forgive me. My name is Anna. I've been a social worker for 3 years. I graduated with my master's 3 years ago and a couple months. And while 3 years is by no means an expert in the field, I do feel like it's given me a good chunk of time to learn and to realize what I wish I had learned sooner. And those specifically are the topics that I would just love to talk with you about. As you know from the title, probably the thumbnail, and the fact that I already mentioned it, today we're talking about boundaries. I feel that in school I heard the word boundary thrown around a lot, but I didn't always know like practically in a real life position as a social worker what that really meant. And I didn't realize that there are boundaries to protect a client, but there are boundaries also to protect yourself from things like burnout. But then you also hear about boundaries in I feel like more of a therapy talk, pop culture buzzword type of way as well. And sometimes I think that that can kind of muddle what they are when applied to your own life, especially once anything becomes a buzzword. It often isn't used correctly anymore, or just like isn't as helpful to know like what it really is and what the benefits are. So when I'm talking about keeping boundaries today, I'm talking about a skill that keeps a clear distinction between the professional and the personal. What I remember is hearing a lot that that is what a boundary was, but it took being in a job and working with people and burning out a bit and improving on just being a good social worker overall, I feel, to really understand boundaries at a deeper level and the different ways they're important and the different boundaries that you may not even think about being boundaries that are pretty necessary to implement. So in this video, there will be two main reasons we keep boundaries. I'm going to focus, well, I'll tell you what they are first. Two of the main reasons to keep boundaries. One is that it is best for the client and protects the client who you're working with. And two is that it is best for you and protects you. Both of these are obviously so important as professionals, especially being held accountable by licensing boards and everything. What we do is for the client and to do the best that we can for them. That obviously is such an important part and we will talk about it, but I also am going to focus a little bit more on the boundaries that protect you because that kind of just goes with this series and what we're talking about. In the burnout video I mentioned, obviously there are so many systemic reasons that social workers get burnt out, and it a little bit is just due to the nature of the job as well. We also are empowered to practice skills and get better at skills that prolong you getting burnt out and help you be a great social worker for a sustainable period of time. So we'll talk about both of those, but like I said, if I talk more about why boundaries are good for us as social workers, it's just because that's my focus. It's not because that is more important. People say it can be hard to keep boundaries, and I think people fall on a spectrum in that of how hard it is to keep boundaries, and I think also every different little category of boundaries, it varies of how difficult it can feel maybe sometimes to keep them. Like there are very clear-cut boundaries that no social worker should have any issue with keeping, and then there are some too that people might convince themselves that they're selfish by setting a boundary there, or that it doesn't really matter, or that you can make it work anyways. And so some reasons that it can be hard to keep those boundaries that feel more for the benefit of you than the benefit of others, I often find is that you have to fight people pleasing in order to know a boundary that is what you need, set that boundary, and then keep that boundary. Sometimes you do have to fight people pleasing skills because if you're setting a boundary, then there's obviously a line there that maybe not everyone realizes or knows that that is your line. Having people pleasing tendencies can make it hard to set boundaries sometimes and to keep boundaries. Another reason it can be hard for social workers to keep boundaries sometimes, and I'm not saying this is okay, I just think this is a reason why it can be hard, is that many of us came into the profession to help people, and sometimes by wiggling on some boundaries that we'll talk about coming up in the video, people might just think like, oh, I'm just helping my client more. This is actually helpful for them. I'm going above and beyond to help them, not realizing that it's pushing boundaries and ultimately won't be good for the client or for you in the long run. But I think sometimes, probably especially newer social workers, can get caught up in the, oh, I'm supposed to be helping them, so I'm just going to keep on helping them without having like a line set, a line drawn. It can also be hard because sometimes when you're in the thick of it, you're not necessarily thinking about your strategies that you can take to be sustainable as a social worker. You're just focused on the problems and the tasks right in front of you, which makes sense. But burnout, as previously discussed, you should probably go watch that video, is a trajectory, and each of the small decisions that you make in a day, I feel as a social worker, is either pushing pushing you closer towards being burnt out or is prolonging the time that it'll take you to get burnt out. But I do get that sometimes you're just really busy and you have short-term focus, like you can only focus on what's right in front of you and you're not necessarily thinking about those long-term things. So that's where I think that boundary discussions to have are really important to have on the front end before you even begin a job, maybe before you graduate, because it is easier to set boundaries and just start that way and know kind of how you're going to operate while having reasonable flexibility than it is to be working one way for so long and then try to backpedal and set boundaries. That is much harder to do than just kind of having your framework that you already know. Now with that, I do think we need to mention what boundaries are not. Boundaries are not excuses. Like you can't get out of doing something that you do need to do by like saying it's your boundary to not do it. You know, like boundaries have reason. There are things that you do need to do, but with that, then there also are lines to be drawn that you choose not to cross. I hope my words accurately reflect this, but your boundaries are not... when I say this first sentence, it's not going to sound right. Your boundaries are not actions other people have to take. Your boundaries are things for you that then inform how you proceed forward. Other people, though it would be great if they did, other people have no obligation necessarily to follow the boundaries you set. That's why it's important for you to know your limits and your own boundaries and your own framework so that you know how to respond when that happens. For example, and we'll talk about the practical boundaries in a second, but for example, if your boundary is that you don't accept work calls after you clock out at 5 p.m. That does not necessarily mean that your work won't call you after 5 p.m., but that is on you to determine if you are answering and how you address it moving forward. Every workplace is different. If you're like on call, then that obviously can't be a boundary of yours. But if you are like clocked out and no longer working and have no obligation to work, then like that's a boundary that you may have. If your boundary is that you're not accepting work calls after 5 p.m., that doesn't mean that other people have an obligation to not call you after 5 p.m. That means that your boundary is on you for how you're going to respond. And that's where you can see like being a people pleaser. Sometimes you may not want to not answer a call, or you may not want to follow up with someone and discuss the fact that that is a boundary you have and you will answer that call. Or if you're not prepared for it and you think, oh, I'm being so helpful, I'm just like doing my work and I'm doing so good at it, then you might accept a call because you're thinking like, oh, I can probably help in this instance, maybe they need me. But as soon as you're answering those calls, then you're showing that that's not a boundary you have. So that's kind of what I mean with like your boundaries are on you, in the sense that yes, there are things that people should not infiltrate you on, but like people aren't necessarily going to know not to do that unless you have that boundary and you keep that boundary and you're consistent with that boundary, and then it's on you for deciding how you're going to respond to that. I saw when I was just like looking up some discussion about this topic before filming this video that someone said boundaries are not walls but they are bridges. That didn't like specifically resonate deep in my heart, but if it specifically resonates deep in your heart, then you can think of it that way. Starting first with the professional boundaries that are between like you as a social worker and a client, that are for the benefit of both yourself and the client. Having professional boundaries means knowing what is and what is not appropriate between a social worker and client relationship. Now that can obviously have like the huge meanings with things such as you cannot have sexual relationships with a client. Like that's a boundary. Yes. For the most part, hopefully people aren't pushing that one, and if they do, they lose their license. But professional boundaries don't only mean that. Looking at the Code of Ethics is a really good guide to know pretty generally, but also like the big hitters of what to do and what not to do and what boundaries to have. But overall, having professional boundaries with clients prevents role confusion. It reinforces professional standards. It promotes the shared goal that you have of positive outcomes. It avoids having clients become dependent on you, because as a social worker, your goal should always be for a client to no longer need you, not for a client to be getting more and more dependent on you. And boundaries play a big role in that, but you're using your professional skills in a professional role with a client, no matter what social work role you're in. So obviously there's the big ones that are like non-debatable of boundaries that you do have to have as a social worker, and those are the ones that are found in the Code of Ethics. Now there also are areas of boundaries where each social worker might be different, and that's okay as long as you know yourself, you know your boundary, and you're not pushing your boundaries. So these might be things like physical contact with clients. Depending on the setting, some social workers, if it is like culturally appropriate, not harmful to the client, all of the asterisks that go with it, may be comfortable with like a hug hello. Some social workers are no physical contact other than a handshake, and that's a boundary they have for themselves. Another boundary that social workers differ on is self-disclosure. Some social workers will not do any self-disclosure. Some social workers may tactfully use self-disclosure in establishing rapport. This, just like physical contact, are things that just need to be thought out and need to be understood within the context and need to be understood the effects on the client. Like, does your self-disclosure in this moment help the client feel more comfortable with you as a professional, or is your self-disclosure in this moment furthering a like friendship that is outside of a professional realm, which you should not be having? This one's discussed in the Code of Ethics too, but there's also boundaries that you can think about with accepting gifts. There are direct specific no-nos with accepting gifts as a social worker, And then there also are times where it would be like culturally insensitive or insensitive to the professional relationship you have to not accept a reasonable small gift. These are the things that just need to be thought out and thought about the effect on the client. And if you don't know how to navigate that well when you're first starting, that's where having a good supervisor can be really helpful to help you navigate those things. A practical example of a really good professional boundary to have is to never give out your personal phone number. Another one with that is to never engage, follow, or friend any client on social media. That's blurring a boundary. Another practical example of having boundaries with clients would be to not give any client special treatment over another client. Now, I feel like it's just natural human to human whenever you are a professional and a client that there are going to be people you just like easily mesh with quicker and more easily versus people that you may not and you may really have to work to mesh with. But it is on us as social workers to check that and regularly be assessing, am I treating this client differently than I am another one? Am I going further for this client than I would another one? Am I doing more for this client than I would another one? Am I more lax on other boundaries that I've set with this client than I would be with another one? And just staying mindful of that. Another professional boundary that starts to sort of go into other categories that we'll be talking about, but is not doing off the clock work. If you are not getting paid for your job, don't work for your job at that time. That's how I feel. I know that sometimes agencies do weird things to expect that, but a job is a job. And so if you're doing a job, it should be paying you to do that job. Me personally, if I'm not clocked in, I'm not working. If I am clocked in, I am working. But that's just a boundary that I have. Some boundaries are set in place to protect yourself safety-wise, both physical safety and privacy safety. And I think a lot of this depends on your setting as well and what you're doing. For example, I thought a lot more about my boundaries for my own safety whenever I was working in jail, just due to the nature of it, than I necessarily do now. But there still are things that you think of. For example, if part of your job is doing home visits, then there are certain safeguards that social workers take. I don't have too much experience, so I can't like give the nitty-gritty of that, but I'm sure that there are people who have talked about it. But there are certain safeguards that people take that having boundaries would mean like having a baseline, what you do at every single home visit. You wouldn't think like, oh, I'm not gonna share my next address and like estimated time that I'm leaving whenever I go to this client because I trust them. Like I know I'm not a danger there in their home. Even if that may be true, it's just thinking like if it's your routine to always notify your emergency contact of like where you are and when you're expecting to leave, then you're gonna do that every time. You're not gonna think, oh, I'll probably be fine here and not do it. Like having a boundary for your own physical safety would be doing those things every single time that you're working with a client. Partly because that helps address biases as well, but then also partly because your baseline safety things shouldn't be optional if they're the things that you've set for yourself to make yourself be safe and make yourself feel safe. And then with that, privacy goes into that a lot as well. In the field of social work, you're not necessarily going to always make everybody happy. And again, I do think I thought more about privacy as well whenever I was at jail than I necessarily do now, but that doesn't mean it's not important now. So like some boundaries or safeguards that I've set for myself are limiting the amount that I'm searchable on my truly personal social medias. I mean, I think on Facebook I have one of the like friend security things where it's like someone has to be a friend of a friend, I think, to even request being a friend, something along those lines. I don't remember exactly, but just knowing like what about yourself may be public and what you feel comfortable with being public versus not, and what you feel comfortable with if someone were to look you up, like what they would find, how much they would find, and just ensuring that you're comfortable with that. Now moving into the boundaries that feel less tangible but are just as important. You are responsible for setting, holding, maintaining, enforcing your own boundaries, and sometimes that can mean to yourself as well. So the second part of boundaries and why we set boundaries are for your emotional well-being. Remember how we defined boundaries in the beginning is that it keeps a clear distinction between the professional and the personal. In a profession that is prone to burnout, it is so crucially important that you keep a chunk of your life that is your personal life, that is not you as a social worker. And that's just like for sustainability, for you being an individual, for your identity not being fully in your job. Like there's so many important reasons why you do that. But in order to keep those two distinguishing, and they don't have to be like so separate from each other, but just like having spaces that are separate from each other. In order to do that, there is this little line in the middle that is up for you to define and then figure out practically how you're going to hold that there, because the easiest way to fix burnout is to not get burnt out in the first place. And having boundaries with your own self to protect your personal life and yourself as an individual is crucial to do that. I think it would be hard for me to tell you what boundaries you need emotionally, and that's because everybody does have their unique bandwidths. But I will say it's not a bragging point to not have boundaries and to be like, look, I don't have boundaries and I'm good. That's not a bragging point, because either you have some unhealthy mentalities happening there or you're not going to be good in the future. It's something's going to come up where you're not good. Boundaries aren't always going to be comfortable. They're not meant to be comfortable. When you're setting them with your own self, because they're kind of like rules you have for yourself, or that your ideal self has set for your current self. And if it wasn't something that was a struggle, then you wouldn't be having to consciously set that thought. So they're not always going to be comfortable. One emotional boundary that you do need to have that is for your own benefit and also benefits the client is to not become over involved in clients' lives. We see a lot of the darkest parts of this world. It also is our job to know our role in our clients' lives and to not be expanding outside of that role or becoming more enmeshed in their life than you need to as a professional. This obviously is the best for the client, but also if you become over involved in clients' lives repetitively, then you're taking on more emotions than you need to be. You're taking on more burden than you need to be, more heaviness than you need to be, sometimes even just more messiness than you need to be. And if it's not helping you do your job better, then that's where you reach the like over involved part, to where you need to know your role and you need to know what your role encompasses, and then you need to stay within your role in a client's life. Like I said, for the good of them, but also for the good of you and for your bandwidth and for your sustainability as a social worker. It is important for you to understand other people's emotions, understand other people's burdens without wearing them heavily on your shoulders as well. That is something that takes a whole lot of practice, because not only do I feel like most people who go into social work are just naturally more empathetic people, but we also learn how to be empathetic well. Most of us care a whole lot, which is a great trait to have, and I do not want you to remove like any humanity or any heart from yourself. I don't mean that at all, but I do mean there is a skill to learn that doesn't always come naturally, especially in the beginning, of feeling with other people, but not necessarily feeling for other people their burden on your shoulders. You can help them alleviate their burden of whatever it is they're going through the skills that you have and through the active listening and the support or the tangible resources, like whatever your role is. And I do think it's really important to understand the weight of people's situations and to understand what it's like to walk in their shoes. Like those are such important skills, and I don't want that to get glossed over at all. But there is a distinction between understanding what it's like to walk in their shoes, feeling compassion for them, understanding what they're feeling, and not wearing that. You are not made to carry every person's heavy emotions, and that does not mean that you need to be less compassionate at all. It just truly means that this is why we have boundaries, because you can't have all of that weight on your shoulders. And so a practical application of making that distinction may be things like, and my mom and I were just talking about this a couple weeks ago, so it does expand outside the field of social work because she's a teacher. But for example, if you're awake in the middle of the night finding yourself thinking about a stressful situation at work or thinking about a client and their situation, that could be a boundary that you need to set with yourself of like, it is not helpful for me to be laying here awake, missing out on my sleep, ruminating about things that I cannot change right now. Like I'm not working right now. It's the middle of the night. I cannot do anything about this right now. I'm not about to have some great epiphany that's going to change everything. It is not helpful for me to be literally losing sleep over this thing. And so setting the boundary of, I'm not thinking about that right now. Easier said than done. But identifying those things in yourself of what do I need to do to be a human person who is a social worker and not let it be all consuming. And personally, I don't think a boundary can be like, I'm never going to think about work outside of work, because that's not realistic at all. And there are a lot of things that we are witness to that you need to process in your brain. Like, I don't know about y'all, I don't know where you work, but I see a lot of things in a day, and I see a lot of really sucky things in a day, and I need to process that. But having limitations to that. Maybe it is like on my commute, I can process through the day, but then by the time I get home, I need to kind of switch back into being my person self instead of my social worker self. Or if like that doesn't fit perfectly for you, maybe like, I don't know, a walk before work in the morning is where you can like process through things you've been thinking about. But just having like a set time, and then outside of that set time, working to not think about those things. I do so recognize that there's a lot of privilege that comes with that, and I think we just have to hold all of those truths at once. It was really hard for me to set mental boundaries like that for myself, especially when I worked at jail. It still happens now at the hospital too, because I am so aware of the fact that I can go home to my bed, and that doesn't mean that my clients are, and that doesn't mean that their situations are better or like not happening because I'm not there. And sometimes it does feel selfish to like try not to think about it, but that's where I think you just have to be aware of the fact of like, you are a person living your own life, and while your professional role is to help alleviate the stress that others are going through in whatever role that may be, whatever setting that may be, that does not have to take away your livelihood. You're going to have enough stress in your life. You're going to have enough of your own personal trauma, your own personal hardships in your life that you can't wear everybody else's. And I think once you like know yourself and know when you're prone to do that, then it becomes a lot easier to do. But right in the beginning, like I didn't know myself. I wasn't aware of the fact that all of my days were like consumed by my my job as a social worker. I just thought that was normal because I cared, and like I said, caring is a good thing. But in order to be sustainable and prevent burnout, then these are mental, emotional boundaries that are really important to have and to keep, even though they won't look the same for your neighbor as they do for you. Along with that, kind of the same thing but worded a little bit differently, is that a pretty good boundary to have is that while you are at work, you give all that you reasonably can or should to work, and then once you're not at work, you don't give anything to work. I think that goes right along with what I was saying just a second ago, but if worded differently, it helps it click a little bit better. Then I hope it's helpful in that way. And I do get that not every job respects this, and I think that if there is a job that is continually pushing boundaries that you feel are important, such as not working when you're off the clock, or like not taking work home, if those are boundaries that you feel you need and that a job is like continually pushing, then that's when you just have to weigh the pros and cons of how long it is reasonable for you to be there, and or like, are the pros strong enough that that con is worth it? Like, it's individual. It depends person to person what their mixed bag of pros and cons that they're willing to handle are, and it takes a lot of self-reflection, and it does take some trial and error, but give everything that you reasonably should while you're at work, and then stop giving yourself to work whenever you're not at work and not getting compensated for it anymore. A benefit of having these emotional boundaries, not becoming over involved, not wearing other people's burdens and traumas, is that you can remain objective. I think we hear a lot, like if you're a therapist or if you're a social worker not working in a therapy setting, no matter where you're working, but like you are a soundboard, you are an unbiased third party for a person. You are supposed to remain objective as you are helping this person with whatever you're doing in whatever setting you're doing in whatever role you have. And if you become over involved or like a little bit enmeshed in a client's life, then you're no longer objective. And to do your due diligence as a social worker, to be the best social worker you can for a client, you do need to remain objective, and that's a non-negotiable. So if you're feeling like boundaries are selfish or boundaries are things that you can't handle, circle it back to, it's not only best for you, it's also best for the clients in order for you to be the best social worker you can be for them. Emotional boundaries like this are necessary. Some boundaries you may have to set for yourself, and sorry, I feel like I'm kind of bouncing all over the place, but that's what we get for having bullet points instead of a script. Some boundaries that you may have to set for yourself and keep day to day are how you triage and prioritize tasks and needs during a day. I do find that this is something that I have to do quite a lot, but if you have like what you're doing in a day, you know what is urgent, what is high priority, what is important, and you know what things are further down on the list. And just because something is further down on your list doesn't mean that everybody recognizes everything else you're doing in a day. And this is where like you have to be flexible, because truly if something is more urgent than you originally thought it was, like be flexible with that. Be a good social worker. I'm not talking about that. So like it's hard to talk like generally, but for example, in my job, there are days where there may be a bereavement happening. That is high urgency, high importance, high priority. And on that same day, someone may have a question about like an outpatient resource that might be helpful for them a few months down the line. Even if that outpatient resource might feel so very important to that family, because it is, it's going to stay on my list and I'm going to address it. But my first priority is the family that's experiencing a loss actively at that moment. And there have been times where I may keep getting reached out to about things that are lower down on the triage list whenever I'm handling something very, very important and timely that you can't just like ignore, like stuff to address, but that is a boundary to where I'm not going to leave what I'm doing that's really important right now just because someone else would like me to, when I know my proper triage and my proper prioritization of where I need to be. And that's a boundary. I know where I need to be and what I need to be doing right now, and so I'm going to be doing that even if someone else thinks it's different. Now obviously things like that take some confidence, which can take practice and can be harder in the beginning. And so that's where really boundaries, in this sense, there are boundaries you cannot play around with that are not great, but in this sense, these types of things, you really just have to find like your concoction of boundaries that protect yourself and make you be best for your clients. And probably at no point is anybody perfect, but you do have to try your best. You do have an obligation and a responsibility to try your best so that you can be in this job for the time that you would like to be in it, and that you can serve your clients the best for the time that you're in it. I think to end this video, it's important to circle back around to something I've said so many times before, and I'll continue to say too, but no matter how much you would like to be a whole entire machine all by yourself, your role is a cog in the machine, and it is your job and your responsibility to be that cog the best that you can, but you cannot be the whole system, nor should you try to be. And by doing things like setting boundaries and remaining your perfect cog, then you're able to do your job really well, and hopefully enough really great social workers can be placed at all different points, at all different parts in a system, that the whole system can improve and be really great. But we can advocate for big change, we can care about big make change, but whatever role you're in, you can do your role. And you're not responsible for everything that's outside of your role. You're responsible for doing your job really well, for making your clients feel seen, feel heard, for doing your best at helping them in whatever position you're in. But your boundaries are important, not only for your client, but for yourself as well. Please let me know what you think about this video. I always fear at the end of these, I just like rambled and nothing made sense. But let me know your thoughts. Let me know if there's anything you agreed with or anything you disagreed with. This is just a heart-to-heart. It's an open conversation. I'm personally just like sitting on my bedroom floor talking to you. I don't know where you're at when you're listening to me, but I am waiting to hear what you think. If any of this resonated with you at all, make sure to subscribe before you go. If there are other topics you would like me to cover in videos like this, definitely let me know and I'll add it to the list. You're doing great though, and I'll see you next time.